You are listening to the National Gang Center podcast, Voices from the Field. In each episode, we hear from experts and go in depth about their stories and experience with addressing gangs and communities. This program is supported by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. The points of view and opinions expressed within do not necessarily represent those of the U.S. Department of Justice.
I'm Sean Baldwin. Welcome to our podcast. This episode will focus on understanding the impact of trauma on those exposed to gang violence and how trauma-informed policing can be applied to interrupt the cycle of violence. To help us with this discussion, we have an expert joining us. Chief Inspector Altavice Love Craighead began her law enforcement career in 1994 as an officer with the Philadelphia Police Department. Since then, she's climbed through the ranks and currently serves as Chief Inspector in charge of their Community Relations Bureau. Along the way, she co-founded the Amir Healing Center to help those that have lost loved ones to murder, and she has become a leading expert in trauma-informed policing. Altavice, welcome to our podcast.
Hi, Sean. Thanks for having me.
We're extremely fortunate to have you, so thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I've heard you say that you didn't choose to become an expert on trauma.
I did not.
Do you mind sharing with us how that happened?
So in 1997, my only brother, Emir Green, was shot and killed in Philadelphia. And you know, there's a process that you go through when you're grieving, particularly with a sudden death, because there's no illness before. And, my mom was pretty good with making sure we got support from other agencies, from other individuals. But in the police department, I found myself placed into assignments that would allow me, or that could allow me to tap into my personal experience and use that personal experience to improve policing. And I remember one time my sister saying to me, I was assigned to Violence Prevention Bureau, working under a deputy commissioner. And my sister said, "You seem to keep running from these opportunities where you can share what happened to our brother." And I said, yeah. I didn't feel like I was ready. I felt like I still had to process my emotions. It was still difficult to talk about. And even now, when I talk about it, I cry because it's something that really never goes away. So she suggested, why don't you just go with it and see what happens? And I did. And that was just as simple as taking that position in violence prevention.
And is that how you came to co-found the Amir Healing Center? And what does Amir stand for?
Emir is actually the name of my brother. And it's ironic how it happened. My mom, a person who always sought information, like she's just a researcher at heart. She was looking for places to go to find support for mothers who had lost loved ones to homicide. And when she would go to different places, people would stereotype her because my brother was killed involving criminal activity. He actually sold drugs, and the person he sold drugs for was the one that killed him. And people would say to her, "Oh, our children were killed innocently." And, I always say there's no innocent or guilty in violence because, nobody deserves their life to be taken away. But she found herself faced with that quite often. And she found herself one day screaming, "Every murder is real. Every murder is real." And then she stopped and she thought, wait a minute, EMIR, my brother's name. And so we started out calling it the Every Murder is Real Healing Center. Now we just call it the Amir Healing Center.
Now, that's an incredible story about turning a personal tragedy into some triumph and action that I know, based on what I know about you, that is impacting law enforcement's response to these violent crimes all over the nation. So thank you for that. Thank you for having the courage to do that and spend the time with us today and what you're doing all over the nation.
Thank you. You know, it's interesting. When we started, I didn't want to be silenced. I felt like behavior or reactions like that, oh, our kids were innocent, shames you. So for me, it was my voice will be heard. And when my mom started the organization, she wanted to make sure that everybody who wanted it, and everybody deserves it, whoever wanted support should get support no matter what the circumstance.
Again, that's incredible. So let's talk about trauma. And I think it's important for us to start with making sure everybody understands what trauma is. So what is trauma?
Trauma is essentially a reaction to some kind of context. It could be an incident, it could be your environment, but it's your personal reaction to something that has happened. And for me, my trauma comes from my brother's murder. And oftentimes when people experience trauma, they're hypervigilant. They could be depressed. They could be, they could turn inside and not really talk to people. They try to avoid people. There's a bunch of reactions that go along with it. And, we call sustained trauma, which is trauma that you live constantly. Sustained trauma is trauma that never goes away. That's a different level of trauma because your trauma is compounded. And so for people who may have a personal experience, for instance, like me, where I've experienced my brother's loss, but also I live in a community where there's shootings all the time and I hear gunshots all the time. That's sustained trauma. Trauma can relate to poverty. If I'm constantly looking for a place or a way to get food for my family, that's sustained trauma on top of being traumatized by an individual incident. It could be social issues. If you're African American or a person of color, and you're always trying to find and navigate your way through a system that doesn't really support you as an African American person or a person of color, that's sustained trauma. It's living with it constantly. You're constantly trying to figure out how to navigate your life. For me, with my trauma, it comes and goes, meaning at some point I can live a normal life, but then I can be triggered by one thing that reminds me of what happened. For me, oftentimes it's the season. When the season changes from March to April, we go from being cold to getting warm. That's the time period my brother was killed. And it triggers my mind to remember that. And oftentimes I'll get depressed and I don't even know why. And I'll have a discussion with my mom. I'll say, I feel so sad for some reason. And nothing happened. And she'll say, oh, look at the date. Look at the time of the year. And it reminds me of my brother. And that automatically makes me sad. His birthday, is just a reminder that he's not here. If there's a family gathering and, it's a family gathering that we used to do with him, we continue to do it, but he's not there. It could be a reminder that can trigger you and actually set you back into your trauma responses.
Yeah. So you mentioned living in a community that where there's gunfire, there's shooting activity, and how that exaggerates the problem
Right.
with trauma. I was worked as a police officer for 25 years in a community that was deeply impacted by gang violence, too much gang violence. And I can remember as a chief of police, I went to a third grade class. It was Civic Day at this school that was in the area that was most impacted by the gang violence. And there were two classes together that I was reading to. And so there were about 60 children in the room, which is way too many children to be in a classroom.
Right.
So each class had a teacher and a teacher's aide, and they were doing the best that they could to keep these kids, sort of focused on what we were doing and paying attention to me and not interrupting. And I got through the first maybe 3 pages. It had taken like 15 minutes to get through 3 pages of the book that I was reading. And a little boy who's in third grade stood up and told me about his cousin being shot the night before in front of his house and gave pretty graphic detail about what happened. It was obvious to me. I had been on that crime scene earlier, that night before, and it was obvious to me that this little boy saw this happen. I mean, he
Right.
just had way too much detail to have heard about it. And for me, that was one of those moments in my career where my whole philosophy of policing changed. Because how do these kids that are suffering this trauma that this is going on a nightly basis on this little boy's street, how are they possibly going to be prepared to come to school and get the education that they need
Mm-hmm.
to have a successful life? And
Right.
that really deepened my thinking about the role that we play and how important public safety is and the health of our communities. So maybe if I could sort of head in that direction a little bit, and then so these neighborhoods that are impacted by gangs, we know suffer increased exposure to violence. How does this violence and this repeated trauma impact victims, witnesses, and even just the larger community?
You know, as a police officer, we see and hear bad things all day, every day. You know, we see people at their worst times, and we're exposed to the trauma, right? And I remember one day I was working as a sergeant, and there was a shooting. We hadn't found a victim, but we found casings all over the street. And I remember saying to one of the officers, I am tired of this. This is exhausting. I can't wait to go home. And I didn't know it, but one of the residents that lived on the block was standing at her door. And she responded, at least you get to go home. I have to stay here. And that was my first experience of realizing what trauma does to a community and to a neighborhood. You know, you can be, the most productive person in society. But if your circumstances require you to live in a neighborhood where there's constant violence, you become part of that traumatized community. And it's often difficult for them to figure out a way to navigate. And so that's why it's important for police officers to understand trauma, because we are who people see first. When they're having that worst day, when they're living in a neighborhood that they can't escape, we are who they see first. And it's important that we know how to support them. That was my aha moment. Like, yeah, you do get to go home, but what about her? What's available for her? And so that was when I realized that I had to be more sensitive to the needs of people and communities that can't escape. I needed to know the resources available so that I can say, hey, this might be the case for you, but here's where you could go to get some support so that you can have a moment to escape the reality of that, right? So you can have a moment to be able to go on with your life so you understand that trauma doesn't have to happen forever. That was it for me. And I think that really probably that was part of my journey of getting here today.
I'm sort of reflecting on my career, moments in my career similar to what you just explained. And I think that sometimes police officers will see that when they're trying to work with the community, they're trying to work to witnesses to these violent crimes, and even victims to these violent crimes. Sometimes they won't speak to the police. And we interpret that as if people are being uncooperative with the police. Or lying.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to step back and we need to understand the impact of trauma, because for them, this is life or death. It's literally life or death. And then when you add the gang violence in, there's this whole level of fear that comes, continuing fear, intimidation that comes with it. How do you think all this trauma contributes to a cycle of violence in these communities?
Yeah, so let's think about it. The young man the student that you mentioned that stood up and told you that he witnessed the murder, well, essentially told you the scenario, implying that he witnessed it. How do you expect that child to process what happened? Murder, violence is abnormal, and people have reactions to those abnormal situations. And what ends up happening is the behavior of the person gets labeled abnormal. And oftentimes I tell people, no, your reaction is normal. It's the situation that's abnormal. And if that child doesn't get support, that child won't be able to stay in school and study. That child won't be able to focus. That child won't be able to live a life of a child because he'll constantly replay that over and over in his head. Kids haven't developed healthy coping mechanisms sometimes when they see violence like that. And if they don't develop those coping mechanisms, they look for other ways that are unhealthy. That could be, drug abuse to numb the feelings that they have. It could be just being with people that aren't supportive. For kids, they need supportive people around them. We all have different levels of resiliency. So what impacts you one way may not impact me the same way. I may require more support than you do. That's why it's important that we have teachers that are supportive. We have family and friends that are supportive. But that also includes the police. Police can also be supportive mechanisms for young people to help them navigate the challenges that they face. That's why trauma-informed policing is important, because we can say to the kid, hold on, let's talk about this. What are you feeling? It doesn't require us to be counselors. It just requires us to be listeners, and then to have the wherewithal to direct them to the resources where the experts are.
Right.
And the same applies for adults as well.
So the research tells us that children that grow up in communities where violence becomes a norm are at higher risk for eventually committing serious crimes, joining gangs, specifically in the context of what we do every day. And there's other risk factors that you spoke about in your observations. For instance, academic failure. If a child is not progressing in the way that they should be academically, that failure is a risk factor for moving on to delinquency and even more serious crime and gang involvement in the future. So yeah, the cycle is real in these neighborhoods. I know when I went to the police academy, I won't say how long ago, but it was a long time ago. We got very good at how to conduct interviews and investigate crimes and collect evidence and do the forensics and all of that. I cannot remember. Certainly we didn't have a class, and I don't even think there was the discussion about the impact of victims in these violent crimes, or even how to approach victims and there's certainly back then, I'm not sure that there were any states, may have been a few, that had victim rights laws that directed us and gave guidance in how to support victims. And that, so how do these traditional, I'll call them traditional police responses, so non-trauma informed responsive, how do they negatively impact the outcomes for victims and witnesses, and I guess maybe even offenders?
Well, if you think about it, a crime has happened to me. The police are the first persons I see because they are the ones that respond. And then when they get to me, they tell me I'm lying. Or if I'm having a traumatic reaction, I could be panicky, on high alert. They may deem me as crazy, right? If I am numb and maybe I'm not crying, sometimes they'll say, well, if that really happened, wouldn't they cry? She's just standing there stoic, though, so maybe she's lying. It's those reactions that will prevent people from wanting to cooperate with the criminal justice system. And if people don't cooperate, then we're less likely to have a thorough investigation. We're less likely to arrest those that have committed the crime. In the end, it's the victim that doesn't get the best result. In addition, if we aren't aware of the resources available in our community, then we can't say to them, here's where you need to go to get help. It could be that the person is so traumatized by the victim experience that they can't go to work. So therefore, they don't have any income. So therefore, they can't take care of their kids. Their kids are not eating, And if the kids are not eating, when they go to school, they're not focused. And so it's incumbent upon us to know what's available in our communities. There's plenty of resources available. There's the Victims Compensation Program where victims can go and get compensated for loss of wages. They can get compensated for loss of equipment. For example, say they have medical equipment and their home was burglarized and that was taken. They can get reimbursed so that they can get that equipment again. So we need to know all of the resources out there that we can provide or refer victims to so that they can get support and get back to what I call a new normal. It's not going to be the same normal as before because once you've been a victim of a crime, you kind of develop a new way of living. You have to, because how do you come back from that? You can't erase that from your memory. So you have to develop ways that will allow you to live your life productively without being overcome by the trauma.
So what is trauma-informed policing?
So trauma-informed policing is actually the practices, protocols, and policies that recognize and appropriately address the complexities of trauma experienced by survivors to prevent further re-traumatization and improve the impact of police intervention. But this applies to perpetrators as well. Because if we're able to intervene early on, we could possibly stop retaliation, right? If we intervene early on, we can help them overcome any injuries that they may have. Usually when people are shot, let's say gang members, for example, if they're shot, they may have survived, but they may have lifelong injuries that they have to deal with. They may not have medical coverage for that. So we need to find ways to help them navigate our systems, research the resources available in the community to make sure that they can tap into them and help them do that. I think, investigating policing and supporting victims goes hand in hand. And, obviously, you've said it, victims oftentimes end up being perpetrators. That's because they haven't gotten the resources and the support that they need to sustain a productive life.
So, and that is so critical, especially when we're talking about gang or group violence, that retaliation aspect. It seems like there's just a constant cycle of retaliation in these communities. And that's why we see these explosions of violence in periods of time in our communities. So what a incredible way to look at that it extends beyond just victims and witnesses, and it's actually the offenders too, that we need to practice these trauma-informed approaches to. So can you give me a specific example of what a trauma-informed approach is or might look like? If I'm an officer or a detective that's responding to one of these violent acts in the community, what do I do differently when I'm trauma informed?
So I'll give you an example. One day when I was a captain, there was a shooting. Usually as the captain, I'm the last one there, right? Because all of the officers go first. Their supervisor might go. I'm at my desk. I'll hear it and then I'll go. And this house had been shot at. Nobody was injured, thank God. But there were bullet holes throughout the front of the house. And as I pulled up, I don't know why, but this lady came up to me and started screaming at me. Out of all of the officers there, she walked up to me and she starts screaming, "Where have you been? You should have known this was going to happen." And my first thought was, I have no idea who you are. I didn't know you existed. I don't know that you live here. I'm only here because your house got shot. But I didn't do that. I took a deep breath and I stood there and I took it. And the ironic thing was somebody behind her screamed, "Mom, stop! That lady doesn't know you." Trauma-informed policing is just taking a moment, taking a deep breath, not being reactive all the time, because that's what we're used to, right? We're used to something happens, we react. This time we're asking you, take a deep breath, pause for a minute. And you have to practice this. It doesn't come easy because we're human beings. Your natural reaction might be to respond or to lash out back at that person. Just take a deep breath. Or it could be, a shooting victim. We're talking about gangs here. So someone gets shot. First thing that happens when they get to the hospital, the detectives show up. Tell me who shot you. I don't know who shot me. We're used to saying, oh, they're not cooperating. And we don't bother going back. We just write them off. We try to figure out another way to do our investigation. I say give them a day or two, maybe 3 days. Let them process what has happened to them. Because in their mind, they're trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together. When you are in a crisis moment, your mind doesn't function the same. When you're sitting in a classroom and a teacher is giving you your lesson, you receive that information, you process that information to figure out or understand what the teacher's talking about, and then you attach a feeling. I like it, I don't like it, I don't care. Well, under crisis, it's totally different. Something happens, a crime's committed, you're a victim of a crime. You immediately attach an emotion to it. You're frightened, you flee, or you freeze. And that information that comes in your mind is fragmented. So you may not see things the way you thought you saw them. You may not hear things the way you thought you saw them. Things may have happened that you don't remember. And if officers give them that time, 1, 2, 3 days, to sit with what happened to them, because they're trying to figure it out too. What did I see? Who did this? Particularly if they didn't immediately recognize the person. And so give them time to process, because they may figure something out. They may remember something that they didn't initially remember. And that may help your investigation. But more importantly, let me ask you this. If somebody shot you, how do you think you would behave? What do you think your reaction would be? I know I would be, oh my God, what's happening? Why me? I don't want to talk to you. I got to figure out why me. Why did this happen? Who did this? And so just give them time to process. Immediately after the incident, we always say for police, that's when you get the most information. But sometimes that's not when you get the most information. Sometimes you do have to wait.
So that is really practical advice for officers, the first responders, and the detectives that are following up on these cases. I know as a detective, I conducted a large number of interviews with a victim immediately following a crime at the hospital, and would sometimes conduct a follow-up interview a couple of days later and get a completely different story. So what do I assume? I assume the person isn't credible. They're not telling me the truth. They've changed their story for some reason, even though I know that the first story that they tell me doesn't really match up forensically with what they might say. They heard one shot when I know there were 12, because that's how many casings I have. And we, as police officers, we understand terms like auditory exclusion and tunnel vision.
Or tunnel vision,
right?
Yeah.
That you just don't see things. You don't see things. And you're right. If you'll give your brain some time to back off and process, the memory becomes clearer. You understand what's happened to you, and you're even able to communicate more fluidly. So that's an incredible example. I heard somebody describe the first time I heard about trauma-informed policing, which sadly was not more than 5 or 10 years ago. I mean, it just wasn't that long ago. It's amazing how we're just now paying attention to this. They described it as leaving the victim in a better place than what you found them, in terms of empowering them, because the investigation and the criminal justice system itself, which is awful to victims. And in most cases, you just re-traumatize a victim. And it's no wonder why a victim says, I don't want to prosecute, and just walks away because they don't want to be re-traumatized. They don't want to relive this experience all over again. And I wish I knew who to credit this to, but we have an obligation to prepare these victims for what's coming. and to empower them so that they they have a role to play, and they have choices that they can make in this process, and do it as a partnership rather than this what we've always done, which is just re-traumatizing
Right.
the victims. So it's incredible the examples that you give, and how real that is. Is there? Can you explain for us how, if we take this trauma-informed approach and we're empowering the victims of these crimes, we're leaving them in a better place than where we find them? Do you think that this effort can improve public safety in our communities?
I know it will.
And why is that?
Well, I base it on my own experience. Fortunately for me, when my brother was murdered, the police officers were great. They were great. My mom, she would make notes of things that she heard in the community surrounding my brother's murder. She would write them down in a composition book. The detectives that investigated his homicide worked midnight to 8 a.m. She would set her alarm clock, and she would call and talk to them and give them these notes. And she constantly apologized. Because, they're random notes. Some might mean something, some may not mean anything. And they told her, don't apologize. It's refreshing that someone really wants to help the investigation. And they encouraged her to keep calling. So you want your loved one's murder solved. You're grief stricken. You're driven to, make sure you can provide the best information you can to help the investigation. The last thing you want is to call the detective for them to say, you're bothering me, or I'm busy. I don't have time. I have another crime. Konzak and Weaver, that was their names. Very, very supportive. And it just showed me that the police community relationship didn't have to be adversary. And even though my family was traumatized and they were working under traumatizing experiences, it didn't have to be that way between the two different groups. I use these terms, and I can't take credit for the terms because I didn't create them. I'm a certified crisis responder for the state, and they use terms safety and security, ventilation and validation, prediction and preparation. And when I thought about the process that my family went through from the moment we were notified that my brother was murdered all the way through the trial, those things were put in place. Safety and security. How can you make the person feel safe? It might be physical safety that you have to address. For example, a burglary. Somebody's door is broken off the hinges. How do you not leave that person there with a broken door? But it could also be emotional safety. Just being supportive for that person. Tell me what happened to you. And the person tells you, and you'll say, I have to take you to the detectives, but let me notify you that you have to tell your story again. And the person may say, but I just told you, I don't want to talk about it again. Just simply explaining to that person. Unfortunately, our system requires that they hear directly from you, because if we catch the person, we need the specific information that you have. But don't worry, I'll be there with you. I'm not going to leave you. And then ventilation and validation. Remember the lady that yelled at me when I walked up? Just let her yell at me. She needed to get it out. But sometimes that validates how people feel. If I would have come back at her, then I would have been minimizing her feelings. It was probably the most scariest moment of her life. She needed to have that moment, and I let her have it. What was it going to do to me? How was it going to harm me? And then prediction and preparation, explaining the criminal justice process from beginning to end. Like when the officer has to say to the victim, unfortunately, you have to tell your story again. Well, guess what? When the person is arrested, I need you to tell the story again to the judge. But don't worry, I'll be there too. I'll be there with you while you tell your story. And that just shows the person you're supporting them, you're validating how they're feeling, and you're letting know there's an end to this process. It's not going to last forever. That way they could get back to their new normal.
Wow, that's great advice. And you frame it so eloquently. As you're speaking, I can't help but to think that this is really about serving our communities by supporting victims in a manner that seeks justice and to improve public safety, which is exactly what we're sworn to do. What advice do you have for chiefs or commanders that want to implement trauma-informed policing in their agencies?
Well, yeah, I would say that they are the key to getting it started, because you have to get buy-in from your department, meaning those below you. If you show as an example how you believe in trauma-informed policing, then more likely they're going to believe it as well. Start creating some policies that are trauma-informed. Talk to your victims and get the victim's voice on what your policies do or how they impact them as victims. It starts with the chief. And if the chief is not ready to be on board, then the rest of the department will not be on board. You got to get buy-in. With the policing, we have a culture, right? Like you said, we were just show up, get the information, move on to the next one. If we don't change that mindset, then it'll never happen. And it only takes one person. When I was the captain of the 16th district, it was interesting how I never really said what the expectation was. I just did what I knew to do. I always involved the community in everything, but I was surprised to see that the officers just followed suit. When they watched me, they knew the expectation and they did it. And I know they did because when I left, I got calls that the next one wasn't the same, and the officers had reverted back to the old traditional ways. It works. You just got to lead by example.
So what's your best advice for an officer that's working in an agency that has not made that transition yet? What can they do to help
They can instill
affect change?
trauma-informed policing in their daily tasks. Start with one thing. Be curious. Be curious. If you're curious about the person you're dealing with, you haven't closed your mind off to them or what's happened to them. You haven't made any individual judgment about them and who they are as a person. You haven't made any judgment about what got them to this point in their life. Just be curious. You'll be surprised at how it'll transform the way you approach policing.
That's powerful advice. So I feel like we could talk for hours, but our time has come to an end. Thank you so much for taking some time to talk with us here today, and just all the work you're doing around the nation to be a champion for trauma-informed policing. I truly believe that is we're searching for that magic bullet. How do we develop better relationships in our community? And this is certainly the path for sure. So thank you so much for being a champion and taking the time today.
Thank you for having me, Sean. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
The National Gang Center is committed to informing, equipping, and training communities to prevent gang violence, reduce gang involvement, and suppress gang-related crime. For additional information regarding the National Gang Center, visit nationalgangcenter.ojp.gov, follow us on Twitter, subscribe to our YouTube channel, or send us an email at information@nationalgangcenter.gov.